Okay, here we're on the Korean problem on page 5 in section 4. And what we're seeing in Korean here is a bunch of verb forms, and these are paired again for the same verb. We're seeing the imperative form on the left and the plain present form on the right. And there's a bunch of sort of confusing sounds here that you don't need to worry about too much. What we're looking for are the allomorphs of the alternating verb roots here. And so the first thing to do, as always, is morphological segmentation. So if you look across a bunch of these words, and I've put a sort of near minimal pair here just to help us along with this, what you find is that all of the imperative forms end in a vowel. For these two, it's the a vowel. For some of the other forms, it's an a vowel. And I will just declare that there is no way to predict which vowel it is. These are arbitrary verb classes, the same way that Romance languages have are and ere and ire verbs. Korean has different verb classes, but some kind of a vowel seems to always be at the end of these imperative forms, whereas all the plain present forms, every single one of them, ends in nunta. So actually, these two particular words both end in nunta. But if you look at some of the other data points, you'll see that that is not a part of that suffix. It's just the nunta that is shared between all the plain present forms. And that suggests that the plain present is a suffix in Korean, attaches to the end of a verb root, and it takes the form nunta. Whereas the imperative, well, if we chop this off, what's left? Chum and num. And over here we find num and oo, something a little bit different. But if you take the same root over here and chop at the root, it becomes clear that that final vowel is going to be the imperative suffix. And sometimes it's an and sometimes it's an ah. That's because there are arbitrary classes of verbs that are just listed in the lexicon in Korean. Okay, so far what we've got is a bunch of verb roots and these two suffixes. This suffix doesn't actually alternate, it just takes on two completely different forms depending on the morphological features of that verb. It's basically just a vowel. This one also doesn't alternate. If you look through the data, it's always nunta. So probably what we're going to be interested in here are the verb roots, and we find some verb roots that don't alternate. So this one is num in both contexts, but some other verb roots that do alternate. So in particular, it looks like we have a final oral stop here before the vowel, but a final nasal stop before the nasal. More generally, it looks like in every case before nunta, wherever there's a preceding consonant, that consonant is always predictably plus nasal. Whereas in this context, before a vowel, these can be either nasal or oral. So which is the phonologically predictable context here, and which is the phonologically unpredictable one? Well, in this context, before a nasal consonant, the consonants here are predictably plus nasal. That looks a lot like an assimilation rule, where two adjacent consonants have to agree in nasality. Now there's a little bit of a complication elsewhere in Korean, but at least with regard to these particular verb roots, this is what we're finding. Right? Now elsewhere you'll see, clusters of two consonants that don't agree in this way, but for sure the alternations that we're looking at, it seems to be the case that an oral stop becomes nasal before a nasal stop. Right? Whereas over here, it's unpredictable whether we're finding nasals or oral consonants. There's no way to phonologically predict this difference. Therefore, it must be in the underlying representations, must be in the lexicon, and nasality is contrastive in this context. So what we have here is going to be two different verb roots that differ in their underlying representations. They contrast for the nasality of their final consonants, If you put a vowel next to this, nothing happens. They surface faithfully, and you get contrast. But if you put a nasal consonant after them, this contrast neutralizes because there is a rule that says minus sonorant minus continuant plus voice becomes plus nasal in the context of a following nasal sound. Right? And so what you get as output here, the contrast neutralizes, and you get, well, you get these forms. An invariant nasal consonant at the end. So this is the basic idea. We have an underlying contrast for nasality that shows up before a vowel, but when you put a following nasal consonant at the end of this root, this contrast neutralizes and all consonants become predictably nasal in this context. Try convincing yourself as well that if you wanted to use this as the underlying representation and try to get this by predictable phonological rule, convince yourself that that wouldn't work. Why not? Well, you'd have to write some sort of a rule like, minus continuant plus nasal becomes minus nasal, I don't know, maybe before a vowel or something like that. So basically, nasal stops become oral before a vowel. That will get you this particular alternating form, but then the same rule ought to apply to this root as well, and that would predict the output here should be nubba, which it isn't. Another way of putting that is that if you're trying to derive this realization by rule, you're essentially saying that the nasality of this sound is predictable in this context. It's phonologically predictable, but it's not. It's unpredictable here. This is, again, information asymmetry. There's more information in this context about underlying representations and contrasts than there is in this context, because in this context the feature is predictable, and in this context it's unpredictable.